For the documentary series Researchers and Their Fields, 24 interviews with academics from Tilburg University were recorded. The interviews focused on the choices researchers make. What is high-quality research, and how do they strive to meet these criteria? To what extent do they engage with practice and theory to ground their work? What inspires and frustrates them? This documentary centers on the relationship with practice. Do the interviewees address applied questions from business or governments, or are they purely driven by their intrinsic desire to know? Is it the responsibility of the researcher to contribute to societal debates? Is applied research academic? How do researchers ensure that they remain independent? What is the relevance of practitioners in your work?
The relevance of legal practice is quite high in legal research. First of all, because many legal researchers in criminal law are also legal practitioners in some way. A lot of my colleagues are either a judge, and not full-time of course, but they will do a case like twice a month or so. Or they are a criminal lawyer, or they work at the prosecution service. That's quite common, and legal research in that sense is traditionally very close to legal practice, which is also one of the points of critique. Maybe we are sometimes too close, and shouldn't we take a step back and look at the bigger issues that are at play? Also look critically at our own legal profession, even though we may be a part of it as well. I do think many criminal law scholars do that in a good way, actually. But I do see the dilemma there, being so close to legal practice, whereas you also want to have a more independent standpoint.
So there's a close connection between the field of law and the academic discipline of law, right? Does that also imply that you interact with lawyers, with policymakers in your research?
Absolutely, because when you study the law has a broad impact. It can have an impact on certain groups of citizens, on individual citizens, but especially in public law, it often has a broad impact on, for example, councils, for example, city councils, or on the judiciary. And I think it's very important when you conduct certain research that you always try to take into account who the stakeholders are, and that you interact with these stakeholders and ask what their aims, ambitions, or obstacles are. So, for example, when the ministry is involved, or when the ministry wants to adopt a certain framework, I think it's important for us to talk to the ministry, and that there can be a mutual information exchange between the stakeholders and academia.
How does the doctrine then relate to practice?
I think, when you're in practice, the main aim of your practice is to get the job done. For example, to win a certain litigation. But in the doctrine, we have the advantage that we can also take time to analyze things very thoroughly. And I think that practice also needs very thorough analysis, for example, of the broader case law, because when you're in a certain case, your only focus is to win that case. But when as a scientist, you can take a step back and look from helicopter view to very different cases, and for example, look at differences between cases, or similarities between cases, and then to develop certain conclusions, for example, that can be very beneficial to the field of practice. And I think that's the main important thing, that we can take more time, take a step back, and conduct a very thorough analysis of all the different aspects that are involved, and that often are broader than the things you see in your daily practice, as a lawyer, for example, or as a judge.
Can you describe your research to me?
Yes. What we do, most of the time I work together with some colleagues, is investigating behavior of companies, and in particularly a number of parties in companies, like shareholders and board members, directors.
And what type of behavior do you look at?
Well, in particularly these elements that are related to legal decisions that need to be taken. So like, for instance, how shareholders vote at general meetings of shareholders within companies.
And what is the purpose of this? With what objective do you look at this behavior?
Well, in particularly what we are trying to find out is if there are specific legal rules. As you know, I work in a law faculty within which, or companies work within the legal environment and have to mandatorily adopt quite a substantial number of rules. Consequently, shareholders that are part of these companies also should behave in accordance with the law, but obviously the law can change. So if we find out some kind of inefficiencies, our research tends to find out where the inefficiencies lie and whether or not we can advise to change the law so that things can work more effectively or more efficiently.
You mentioned earlier that companies sometimes struggle with the room that regulators leave them to interpret legal prescriptions. Mm-hmm. Do you see it, since you study the behavior, how companies go about these legal prescriptions, do you also see it as your task to give back to legal practice or to companies your insights, mm-hmm. to improve their compliance with the law?
Mm-hmm. First of all, we try to do on the one side to find out in our studies whether or not there are possibilities to inform the government or some regulatory bodies what can be done. And at the same time also in our research we often are in close contact with a number of companies or with some regulatory bodies that are closely related to companies, like the employers associations, whereby we provide them with our observations and say so on, hey, we have observed and you are one of the companies that is taking part in this environment, that this and this and this is happening, and in fact this is good or can be steered toward that to improve it. Yes, we regularly do this. So we find out, if I give an example, we relatively recently did a relatively large study about the questioning that shareholders are raising vis-a-vis the directors, so on in particularly environmental issues, environmental and social governance issues. And we found out that if you work together, there seems to be more companies that take it into account, that there seems to be a positive effect from that one. So of course, first of all, that brings into perspective possibilities for shareholders to join, but also for companies to take care when they do that they need to do something. When shareholders stand up and say together instead of one, we want this, how to respond. So we inform them more or less both parties, hoping that this, in fact, we create ultimately, that's what law is often, to create a better society where everybody can live happily ever after.
That almost sounds like consulting.
Consulting, I wouldn't say that. In that perspective, that more and more, it is also one of the ambitions of this university, is to make sure that what you are doing is part of society. It's one of the elements that we have to work into society. The difference is that we never so far have, in an individual case, advised the company how to be, or advised the shareholder how to behave. That is for most of the time also if there is a problem, the attorney, or for lobbyists, and so on and so forth. So far in our research, we didn't individualize it, neither in court, that's not a part of our job, but also neither vis-a-vis companies, that in that particular case you have to behave like this. Because most of the time, not most of the time, what we do is we observe, almost always, if possible, a number of elements, observation, or a number of companies or whatever, so more than one, significantly more than one, and then see what the reactions and responses are.
And is the purpose then also to kind of contribute to new development of laws?
But when I look at my own research and what my colleagues have been doing for a very long time, I think that's always been on their mind to try to make society and specifically the law a little better. Mm-hmm. Sometimes even very explicitly to help judges make better decisions. And it's also, in another way, it's important to not only do this research through external parties, that it's important to keep doing your own independent research, because otherwise the government would totally control our research agenda, would control everything that we would focus on, and that wouldn't be a good thing, of course.
My current research is for the Zero Hunger Lab, and the Zero Hunger Lab focuses on, well, as the name says, on reducing hunger around the world. And I'm using, well, we as a group actually are using mathematical models to, well, search for ways to reduce the hunger. For instance, when there are disasters like now is happening in Syria or what was happening in Mozambique, we are developing models, to think about ways how to get enough food from, for instance, the World Food Programme or from other NGOs to the country Mozambique, for instance, where there is hunger, where there's help needed, and then from within Mozambique to the correct people that are actually under threat or are in the help of anything like food or other things.
Why is that you would prefer there to be a direct application to your work?
I think it's better for the model. It leads to a better model in the end. So if I'm not an expert in most of the fields, so I'm not graduated for Zero Hunger, I'm not graduated in humanitarian logistics, I'm not graduated in knowing all of the rules. I'm not in the field always, so I don't exactly know what goes on in the field. So I need to work together with a company or with people that are in the field to be able to understand what is going on, what are the things that they are working on, and what are the problems that they face. So I can assume what types of problems they face, but it might be completely wrong. So I think it's better to communicate with the people in the field that are actually going to use your model, so that first of all you understand their problem, or at least you think you understand their problem, then you work on your model and you work about it and think about it, then you show actually the result again to the field, and then it could be that it is already correct, but most of the time what happens, well, that's not exactly what I meant, but I want also that you include this and this and this, because we face this into the, if we work with it, then go back again, incorporate those details, go back again to them, and in this workaround you get a much better model that is more applicable in practice. And it's also very challenging to include actually all the factors that they really face, instead of thinking about the factors that they could face, which is a different perspective. Because if I think about it, I might be more likely to ignore or neglect the very difficult aspects that they face. Well, if I communicate and work together with them, I need to include also the difficult aspects, and that makes my research better.
I have the impression that your work is very fundamental in nature, as opposed to applied. Do you engage with practitioners?
I don't, personally. I haven't. But other people who do similar type of research have. There is very obvious applied aspects to this kind of research. An obvious example would be to, if you learn better how a language is learned by different types of subject groups, then that could lead to a better design of educational material for language learners. So in the case of second language learners, this is particularly important because of the immigration that's happening. I know this is of high priority within the Netherlands to actually get immigrants up to speed, and help them to integrate it in the society, which involves them learning the language within the society. So that has a very clear application in that sense. But also there are researchers who focus on certain disabilities or language impairments and trying to use computational models for studying what actually improves the process when there's a certain kind of impairment. These also obviously have applied potential, because you can then help in refining the process of helping to teach language to groups with such impairments.
Does your field relate to practice in a way? Is that relevant?
Yes, it is relevant for because for me, first I talk about me. For me, it's not relevant because I want to know, right? It's fundamental, and I think at the university you should do fundamental research. But I can imagine that if I do studies about autism, that helps maybe, I'm not sure, to remedy autism. I'm not sure. But it's not my goal. But I can imagine that if you get an overview of the field, that there are researchers that are interested in that kind of stuff to help people. I'm not in the business of helping people. I am in the business of understanding people. And if you go a step further, then I can imagine that the knowledge I gather with my colleagues, that is being used to, I'm not sure, to come up with a remedy. No. But it's not that we are focused like a medicine to cure something. That's not our goal.
Well, the purpose of your work is to explain, to understand, but not to prescribe.
No, not at all. No, and that's a bit difficult because we talked about individual differences, and I can only say something about on the group level. If I know something about the group level, I cannot transpose that to the individual level. Mm-hmm. So on the group level, I know something about the brain. I'm not sure about integration of the senses. That is maybe, I'm not sure, different in autism, but I cannot say about that specific person what's wrong in his brain. It's on the group level. It's very difficult because of the variability between subjects to say something about one particular person. That's not doable. Okay. Yeah.
I'm working in the marketing department, so I'm basically studying marketing problems, and I do that using econometric and statistical methods in order to analyze mostly secondary data in order to address managerially relevant problems. The problems that I study are situated mostly in one of two domains. A first domain tries to quantify what the implications are of certain marketing actions, which could be a price reduction, which could be a display activity in the supermarket, or could be an advertising campaign on television. So then the question is, how can you determine to what extent those activities are efficient or effective in increasing market share, in raising profitability, in creating additional sales, and where do those extra sales come from? So that's one stream of research that I'm very much involved in. The other one is related more to the retailing domain, where we are basically analyzing a number of issues that either manufacturers are facing or that retailers, so think Albert Heijn, think Carrefour, are facing in their interactions with one another and in their interactions with customers.
So partly your research questions come from managers, from practitioners, but academics are not consultants. How do you manage that relationship?
But we are not consultants in this. Well, first of all, in business and definitely in marketing, we are an applied discipline. So either certain disciplines you can do your research, and to be honest, we still do that too much, to my opinion, in also in the marketing field, in our ivory tower, where we then devise all kinds of things, and people, we find it interesting, and then that should be enough. I think we are an applied discipline, which means that ideally we are working on problems that are relevant either for society at large or for some key stakeholders in society. And as I said, there can be public policy implications, but other important players are say, retailers, manufacturers, ad agencies, etc. So that's one part of the answer. Two, this is not consulting in the sense that we give advice in exchange for use of the data, because those data are otherwise impossible for us academics to buy and get access to. And in return for our insights, which we then make very clear agreements on that we can publish this without restrictions in the academic journals, we are willing to give some advice. So we get access to the data, that's one. Two, we can publish the results without interference of the company. And three, we can do that at our own pace. And the typical characteristic of consulting work is that they ask you the question and they want the answer yesterday.
But not every practitioner question lends itself to improving marketing theory.
No. And then there are also other possibilities where they can get access to the knowledge. Either they can hire a consulting company, or what also sometimes happens is that we give them advice for free. Very often that's if some of our former students are working there, that we try to give them a head start in order to solve one of the first problems that they encounter. But very often what we do is that then we give some advice in return for access to the data that we really like for another project. So I have done a couple of things that, yes, a former student came a couple of times to my office, we chatted for a while, and then I gave them some advice on how to solve this problem. And in return, we basically got access to extremely unique data, and that they were willing to give us because we had built confidence with our earlier advice. So it's in that sense sometimes a give and take. Yeah. So instead of then being paid for consulting advice in monetary terms, you basically get paid in getting access to data for another project that you really would like to do your research on.
So it's always looking for the mutual benefit of all involved.
Yes, precisely. And many, especially if you work with data providers, you should not go in for the quick hit. You basically want to build a long-run trust relationship in order to get data that otherwise you should not have access to. And in that way, I've done, for example, a project where I got through one of my former students here from Tilburg, where I got access to all the margin data, the profit data of every single SKU that was being sold in one of the leading supermarkets. Now, if there's a whole difference between getting access to sales data, which you can get through a consumer panel or through retail scanner data, but to also have access to the margin data, plus to also have access to who was producing the products and how long were the contracts already running with those different players. That was then a unique opportunity, so that the various days that I gave free advice to my former students really paid off also on that aspect. And we wrote, together with another doctoral student, a paper for one of the leading marketing journals for that, because we were the only ones who had those data. And of course the econometrics needed to be done correctly, but the big selling point of the paper was that we could shed light on something that was otherwise always kept very secretive. And that's the nice thing, is that You deal with real problems, you have nice data, you can play with some statistical tools, and that's what's fun about it.
You refer a lot to practitioners. Are practitioners important in your research?
They are, very much, and I do derive a lot of energy, actually, and a lot of pressures inside when I have the opportunity to talk to practitioners, and to really hear from them what they do not know and what they struggle with in their daily practice, and what I particularly enjoy is to make that bridge between their need, which is of course of empirical nature for us academics, and then translate that specific need into a theoretical relevant question. Just the other day I was sitting at Philips with a colleague of mine and with one of our master students, and Philips is more and more engaged in multi-stakeholder partnerships, so partnership with very important NGOs, very important governmental bodies in Sub-Saharan Africa, to try to have their product, which is in this case, product that is able to detect high-risk pregnancies in a context like Sub-Saharan Africa with huge issues of maternal and child health care. In order to implement that in those contexts, they of course need to interact with NGOs, interact with governments, and so on. But that's not without challenges, because norms, values, ways of working differ dramatically between Philips, the governments, the NGOs that they are interacting with. So how to overcome these challenges, where to start from, and what can we learn from the past? So they needed a master student who can sort of study the process that has led to the design and implementation of the current product, which is considered a success product, and understanding what led to such success. So that's what they tell you. That's basically what they need. From our perspective, we look at that through the literature and the lens of cooperation, multi-stakeholder partnerships, development of trust, and we are interested in understanding what led to the development of such trust and such alignment, goal alignment across the partners. So that's an exercise really of translation between the practitioner's needs and questions and the theoretical contribution that you need to provide. Now, when that works, it's really a good feeling, because then it's a win-win situation. They benefit, we benefit, and the student also benefits, because she's able to really connect what she has learned and to what she has to do in her daily life.
Why is it important to translate the practitioner's need into a more abstract, perhaps academic research question?
It is important for me because, ultimately we were talking about generalizability before. So it is our ambition to do research, to advance knowledge, but not just as a methodological exercise, but to deliver impact. Now, what is impact? For us, it is the impact is really in the dissemination, in the fact that what we study can be generalized and can be implemented by other organizations to further improve their models, their formula, and the way they do things. So that's why we need to have a theoretical contribution, because it means that whenever you have a theoretical contribution, it means that the frontier of knowledge is advanced. And hence, there is a larger pool from which organizations can draw in order to improve what they do in their daily lives. At the same time, it's important to have the practitioner perspective, because that's the other side of the coin, indeed, of impact and dissemination.
Well, my research is based on two different fields, on two different type of undertakings. One is about financial history, so the use of historical data that attempts to answer questions that are relevant for finance today. Another stream of my research is about new financial technologies, that is how cryptocurrencies, peer-to-peer lending, crowdfunding is impacting and changing the way we do finance. Now, a natural question is how the two things are interrelated. One is history, one is new tech. Well, you can think about history as a sort of long sequence of new technological changes, so you can look at them in the past or now, but at the end of the day, the net result is the same. You're looking how technology is changing the way we do finance. In looking at this, you can explain new finance phenomenon and try to find the deep root of what's going on here.
For example, in your fintech research, is there any interaction with practice? Are practitioners involved in the formulation of research proposals? Do you relate to practitioners when you disseminate the findings of your work?
Yeah, we do. First of all, practitioners gave us the data. So we got the data from practitioners. Some of it was taken directly from the web. Another part of it was agreed with a peer-to-peer company. So yes, we do interact with them because data comes from them. So there are various degrees of interaction. One is just clarification about the data, try to understand better the market, try to understand better the business model. So we ask several questions. They leave us free to do what we want with the data. So I never had any constraint, you should do this, but you shouldn't do that. Do we give them the results of our research? Yes, we send them our paper. I would like to do more about that. I wouldn't mind to maybe go back to China because many of my fintech research is based on Chinese data and just give practitioner presentations about what I'm doing and the results we've been finding. It hasn't happened yet, but I hope it's going to happen in the very near future. So, but at the end of the day, yes, we have lots of interaction with practitioners in the fintech type of research.
Yes, they provide you the data because they have an interest in knowing as well?
I think so. I think they also have their own interest in transparency. So these are new companies and they want to create, I guess, a reputation of transparency of what they are doing. As a result, lots of the data were just posted online. And I think for them also cooperating with researchers in a way gives them a good grade, a good rating in their transparency and due diligence and all these sort of things. I guess there is also some interest in understanding how the industry is going to be evolved and involving academics into this, in rationalizing, finding, studying, may help in this dimension.
What is your research about?
My research is about healthcare operations management. So applying operations management in healthcare settings.
And what does operations management study?
Operations management is basically about the primary activities in a company, so the activities that are really necessary to make the goods and the services with which the company earns their money. So it's, for instance, not about the human resources department or the IT department. It's primarily about, let's say, the production of the goods and services of some company.
No. And in healthcare, what does that look like?
Well, more and more healthcare is understanding that you can also look at the way they cure the patients as if it's a production process, and then you can apply principles from production management to make things going faster or more efficient, or with better quality or with more safety.
Mm-hmm. So you apply theory to a particular supply chain issue in healthcare. Do these supply chain issues then also contribute to further building of theory, or is it?
Yeah, that depends on the situation, but it can be in some situations it's more that you help practice, that you can say, okay, the theory is like the Bible, the theory is okay, but if we project that on a certain problem in a hospital or a nursing home, then they get ideas how to improve certain processes there. It can also be that by doing a number of case studies in 3 hospitals together or in 3 departments within a hospital, then these empirical research that they can refine your theoretical starting point, and then it adds to theory also. Oh. And often it's from both sides, because on the one hand, the practice learns from the fact that you put on academic classes, and on the other hand, because in practice that they can do things that are very clever, although never published, and then you can say, okay, well, but that means that this theory should be tuned or refined, or maybe should reject it.
Well, the theoretical development is something that probably we keep to us because I suppose it's less relevant to them. They want the answer to their question. So the answer to their question comes after let's say, we have developed the theory, we have analyzed the findings, and then we come up with a framework. We come up with results, whether it's theory testing or theory building, and that's where we involve them again to sort of provide a check or provide legitimacy to what to our findings. In the process of theoretical development, we typically see that they're not that interested, which is understandable.
Yeah. And then towards the end of the research, you need to again translate your academic work to the practitioner.
Yes, indeed. We do that either with reports. We make sure, however, also in the academic piece to include a section on, of course, we have to managerial implication, policy implication. So that's already, the translation part, as we call it. Oftentimes, we also elaborate on that with a more practice-oriented report.
And that report then, perhaps because of your academic kind of sidestep in their view,
yes,
might result in conclusions that they did not see coming.
Yeah, possibly.
Because they've been disconnected a bit.
Yeah, possibly.
Does that lead to frustration?
Well, sometimes it could, and then we talk to them. Of course, even when you do sort of a project that is sort of, starts from the practitioner, it needs to be clear that you maintain your independence as a researcher, and they have to be prepared to that. So findings might not always be, flattering, or might not always be of immediate value to them. So that's something that we clarify since the beginning. And that's something that they are prepared to, because what they want is a rigorous piece of research. That's what's most important. That's what we bring in. Otherwise, there could be consultants, lots of them, that were happy to do their part. But what we bring in is really the methodological rigor, which doesn't give any guarantee on the kind of findings. Actually, there has been some frustration in the past. I remember once we actually had a project commissioned by a large multinational corporation. They funded 2 PhD students in India because they wanted to have knowledge about what slum dwellers would do or would pay for products that could provide nutrition improvements of children, of women over there. Essentially, we provided the first batch of research and the first batch of findings, and they didn't see any value in it, so they just stopped the funding. So that was quite a frustrating experience, and I learned a lot from it. And sometimes, but I think there's nothing else that we could have done. Maybe we could have involved them a little bit more in the process, so that there was less surprise. But they were looking for a business proposition, and we didn't give it to them. So yeah, maybe we failed, but at the same time, I have the feeling that we did keep our independence as researchers.
And is there perhaps almost a therapeutic angle to it, in the sense that the philosopher tries to help people in understanding the type of questions that he struggles with?
Yeah, if you say it exactly like that, I would agree. But I would also a little bit suspicious to talk about philosophy as a therapy, because there is always the possibility that there is no meaning of life, whatever, and that there is no answer to that question, still worse. But yes, Socrates, the protagonist in the work of Plato, for instance, is often also today used as a kind of a therapy, not to help people, but to help questioning as such. So if you want to help people, there are scientists who will do it much more better than philosophers. So.
And is there then also, say, applied value, direct applied value in the humanities?
I do think there is, but But I don't think that that's the primary motivation to do humanities. But I do think there's applied value. Some years ago, the chairman of the Employers Association in the Netherlands said we need to make German as a language required in schools, because Germany is our biggest trade partner. Well, so too for understanding China and so on. We need cultural experts if we deal with other humans. And of course, not only in trade, but also in other contexts. And I think that moves on. Understanding society is maybe even more. For instance, the European Union has a whole list of urgent issues about climate change and whatever. And those are societal challenges. But to handle those, you also need to understand how humans operate in it.
So what is the relevance for of your academic research for the field? So you use the term applicability. And I think that is a very important question, because on the one hand you see a lot of people who consider themselves fundamental researchers and they are only in their lab doing their things, and it is always complicated. And on the other hand, we have the researchers who say, yeah, I'm doing applied research, and that is immediately delivering some useful knowledge to society. And I think as cultural studies persons, we are somewhere in between. But I do think that this applicability is very important, and that is always a task for us to serve, let's say, the public outside university. I think it's very important. The impact of our research for society is important, so we have to start immediately to think about it once we are starting our research projects.
So you would not be satisfied, in a sense, if your research would perhaps contribute to an isolated philosophical debate, but would not have direct implications for real-world problems.
Yeah, and that is something, and I think that I consider this so important. I think that this is so important because when I started my career 30 years ago, it was sort of accepted that you were a scholar, that what you were writing was difficult, that it was difficult theory, that it was a sort of hermetic language, let's say, a closed-off discussion. And I think that has changed radically. We are much more open now at the university, and we are much more thinking about how can I help to develop things in society and in the world. And I think that's a fantastic development. It's very important.